Our topic today is about nested referencing and redundancy. And so I thought I would begin with just some information that I have gleaned from the Bentley communities about what a redundant reference is. So we're going to start with this lovely picture. Some of you have seen this. You'll see those quote marks, the double tick, also known as a ditto mark. You'll see those on the right-hand side of the references dialog. And you'll notice that you don't see those references in the hierarchy on the left-hand side of the dialog. This is true in all of the products, all of the CAD products. So you'll see this in MicroStation, Open Site Designer, and Open Roads Designer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this happens, why it happens, and all of that. And I just realized that one of the things I wanted to do was to let you know about some changes that happened. I got another webinar posted on the website. So I'm going to bring up the East website in a browser, and I just want to show you where you can, find this information after the fact. I have a what's new on the website under the services column, and you could always go there and it'll tell you the latest changes. Or you can go straight for our East PDF list. This is a great listing and it has all of the webinars. It's also got paragraphs, basically. You can see the black group headers. And so if you're looking for particular information, you can go straight for that paragraph. Our topic for today is going to wind up, I'll tell you right now, it's going to wind up under models, container files, and references. That when I get a PDF out or maybe a link to the webinar, it's going to wind up in that paragraph. The webinar, when I post it, it will be down in the bottom right. I'll just scroll down and I'll see on the right-hand side all of the videos. This is a really long list. I just keep adding to the top, and the whole chapter list of what was done in the recorded session will be there. And so you can see last week's we did advanced create drawing controls, and you can see right where we talked about the right press create drawing command, timing mark 2156. You can hit the link and open up the webinar, the recorded webinar. So I wanted to show you where those were. All right, back to our topic for today. What is a redundant reference and why are we seeing them more often than we have in the past? Well, part of the reason is because we're using nested referencing. We're using a lot. Even if you think you're not using it, we are using it as our deliverables. So what makes a redundant reference is a nested reference that has the exact same location, scale, rotation, and same clip boundary as another nested reference. Or it could be a nested reference that has all of that stuff the same as a direct reference attachment. The nested one would be determined to be a duplicate, redundant, and it will not be displayed. It's done that way for processing speed. Why bother to display something that's just a duplicate? Absolutely. So we improve the processing speed by not displaying them. You can also not control the level display of a duplicate reference, which makes sense. If it's not being drawn, you can't control the levels. All right. The other information I wanted is to explain how you end up with redundant references. I'm just going about my business, doing my work. Well, if you use nested referencing, which we are all using these days, you're going to see the potential for having redundant references. If you use container files have nested referencing. If you use CAD base files, typically you will be creating a model in a CAD base, maybe that has a whole bunch of reference attachments. That is a container file. OPNP files are a type of container file. They contain references to a bunch of other information that also might have references to it. If you are setting your nesting depth too deeply when you manually attach nested references, you can introduce problems with redundant referencing. So the system is designed to not display those redundant ones, so to try to protect you from stepping in the doo-doo too deeply. If you set your nesting depth to like 25 and somebody's just got a string of hierarchy on their references, if they're redundant, it won't take up your processing speed to try to display them all. But what you should do when you are making your reference attachments is just don't nest so deeply. Start with one and increase if you need to. That is my recommendation. If you attach references to any published work directly or a container file, you have the potential of ending up with a redundant reference depending upon how the designer or surveyor prepared their deliverable. I'll show you that example as we go a little bit further. It's important, I think, for me to note for you all how to remove the redundant reference, because that's the biggest thing. We see these ditto marks and we don't like them and we just want them to go away because it looks horrible. And then we realize I can't control the dang thing, so why do I even see it? So if you have caused the redundancy yourself by making an additional nested reference attachment, maybe you want to control the level display differently, so you made an additional reference attachment. We do that all the time. I have an area where I want to display different levels, but in the other areas I want to display, these levels. That might be two reference attachments to the same data. All you have to do is make something different about that reference attachment, either the location, the scale, like if you were assembling a detail and you were using different scales, those would not be redundant references. The rotation, which could happen if you were making a detail manually, or a clip boundary. And now I say clip boundary because that is the fastest way to remove redundant references. If you remove redundant references inappropriately, though, you might have to deal with the display of two files. So just be careful. Don't remove the redundant reference by applying a clip boundary. It's better to remove that actual reference attachment unless you need to display something two times so that you can display them differently. Then, if you need to do that, apply a clip boundary. It doesn't even matter what the clip boundary looks like. It will make the attachment different and it will remove the redundancy. If you notice that you've got a redundancy that's appearing beneath a container file, then you're going to need to talk to the designer or the surveyor who owns that container file and get them to edit the container file to remove the reference to that other information, or to use a toggle that's called ignore attachment when live nesting. I'll show you that in the demo. If you are going about trying to remove redundant references and you notice that those references aren't appearing immediately in the references dialog, you may just need to reopen the file. The references are kind of read into and loaded into the system when the file is opened. The fastest way to reopen a file is to just simply move your mouse down to the key-in window and type the word new file. Actually, if you just type in NE, it will populate it with new file and you can hit enter and it will reopen the file. It will look at the references and check the order again, and it will remove redundancies. If you have remove them. I've also noticed one other thing is that toggling off the display of the reference that has the level and the display capability. If you have redundant references, if you toggle that display off, then the level display and everything shifts to the other reference. Sometimes you have to find it. So it's better, I think, to remove them if you're not going to actually use them by making their levels and their clip boundary different. All right, let me see what else I've got. Oh, I have the demo. Okay, let me go into the demo. I'm going to use MicroStation today as the demo, just changing, and I'm going to try to keep my eye on the chat. And I've got my data. It's just exported out of ProjectWise. It's all in the same folder, so I don't have to go back and forth between different folders. I want to take a look at an OPNP file example. Well, actually, I'm going to start with an example of creating a CAD base. And I'm just going to create a CAD base file. And I'm going to attach to that CAD base these container files. Because when you attach container files, you need to use nesting, live nesting. So I'm going to launch MicroStation Connect outside of ProjectWise. I'm going to create a brand new file in my folder for today. And I'm just simply going to call it CAD base. And it should open up pretty quickly. Now I'm going to open up my references dialog. It's on my drawing ribbon workflow, home tab, attach tools. There's a button right above it, and it opens up my references dialog. I'm going to kind of just leave this open so that we can see the hierarchy on the left and what we're attaching on the right. The hierarchy is important only when we do nesting. I'm going to attach a brand new reference, and the reference I'm going to attach is to the corridor file. I'm also going to select with a control click the geometry container file and the terrain container file, all of those container files. Want to open them all? Yes, I know they belong to a different work set. That's fine. I get this dialog box about reference attachment properties, and it's right here that I want to say, okay, I'm attaching a container file. I need to toggle on the live nesting. So I'm going to take this no nesting and change it to live nesting. I am not going to change the nesting depth. If I change the nesting depth here, that is applied to everything that I attach in this session of MicroStation at a later date, a later time. If I close the file, it'll be reset to no nesting when I attach references. But don't change your nesting depth. This is a best practice. Toggle on live nesting if you need to use nesting and leave the depth set to 1. I'm going to click OK and accept all of these. And when I zoom in, I will notice, I'll zoom in here, that it looks like I see all of the data that I need. I don't need to increase my nesting depth at all. Don't need to increase it at all because I see all the data that I want to see. And I'm going to expand my hierarchy and look for the published files beneath there. And I see published files. And for the terrain container file, I'm starting to see that there's an issue. I expect to see a published file under the terrain container file. So what I have to reveal to you is that I set you up. I set up my geometry file not very well, and it has caused a redundancy. Where am I going to see that redundancy? Well, this is one indication that I have a redundant file, the absence of the file in the hierarchy. It's not there. How do I know it's absent? Well, if I look at the container file, on the left-hand side, I select the container file. I'll notice on the right-hand side, I see the pub file, but I see the double quote, the ditto mark. it's a redundant reference. Why is it redundant? Because there is a reference to the published terrain elsewhere higher up in the hierarchy. So this hierarchy is established by these slot numbers. So what this means is the terrain was supposed to be coming from the survey. It was the last thing that I selected. It was the last thing that was attached, and it was determined to be redundant. So that means one of these container files above it has a reference attachment to the terrain that's not redundant because they're in a higher slot. So I'll look at the geometry container file, and that is where I see the terrain is attached as a reference to the geometry container file. So this is a case where I mentioned this earlier. If you see that a designer or surveyor has left other information attached to their container file, there's no reason to attach a published terrain to a geometry container file. You need to talk to the designer or the surveyor and ask them to either detach the reference, or they could set that reference attachment to be ignored when live nesting. You can't change that right here. I'd like to be able to change that. The button to ignore when live nesting is right between the little grid symbol and the light bulb symbol, but you'll notice it's grayed out here. That's because the person who owns that file needs to make that change. Now, if I was to apply a clipping boundary, I said that might be the easiest way to remove redundancy, is I could apply a clipping boundary. I could apply a clipping boundary to this container file for the geometry. That would make it unique enough that the terrain file would no longer be redundant. So that would be the published file would no longer be redundant. You see how I've got those ticks. I can try that. It's not going to resolve the situation greatly, but it will change it. Let me show you how it changes it. I'm going to select the geometry file. I'm going to use my place fence and just place a fence block. It doesn't matter how big it is. And I'm going to apply a clipping boundary and accept the active fence. Now, I still don't see the published file here, but when I select the terrain, I still don't see it here either. So it looks like this is a case where I would need to reopen the file in order to remove the ditto mark and give the control back. So let's do that. I'm going to use the new file command, NE, hit enter, and it's going to reopen the file. And I will select that geometry. I see the pub file is still attached. I'm going to select the terrain container file, and you might notice no more ditto marks. But now I have two instances of the terrain being displayed in my file, which is not necessarily a good thing. Because if I was trying to fix this display up and make it be really nice for some sheets, I might go into this, into the published terrain, and I might toggle off certain levels, and I would still see them displayed, because this one that's coming from the geometry has a totally different level display mask that's being used. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. I turned that level off. Yeah, where did you turn it off? If you don't have redundant references, you actually have duplicate references that aren't redundant. They have separate level control. So this isn't a good way to deal with that redundancy, not at all. The best way to deal with this redundancy, let me show you, is to open the file. I'm going to use the browse, and I'm going to pretend that I'm the owner of the file, and it's the geometry container file. I'm going to open that. In the geometry container file, I have my references dialog open, and normally the only reference that you have in a geometry container file would be to the geometry published file. But here I see I have a terrain. So for some reason, I wanted to see that terrain. I can either detach it using the detach reference button, or I can use the ignore this when live nesting button. Let me just use the ignore when live nesting. So I've got that set. And then I'm going to open and save the settings. I'm going to open up that CAD base again. Now it's totally ignored when live nesting. So I have a reference to the geometry container file, and I'm going to look at that, and I don't even see the terrain in this list. That's what ignore when live nesting does, makes it invisible. It also means that I don't need that clipping boundary on my geometry anymore. I can remove it because it's not a redundant reference. Now, let's see, I think I wanted to show you something else. I'm looking through my notes. OPNP files. Let me show you using an OPNP file. I'm just going to create a brand new file, new, and it's going to be a CAD base 02 or something. Just another CAD base. And I'm going to attach a reference to the OPNP file. There's OPNP1. You guys might notice when you're looking at these that I've got an OPNP1 and I've got an OPNP2, and they are the same size. They're actually just copies. I made a copy of OPNP1, so it's an identical copy. So it has the same structure. And I just wanted to show you what happens when I make multiple reference attachments to really the same data. And I could attach the OPNP1 a second time, but I thought it might be a little bit more straightforward to just use a copy of it with a different name. So I'm going to make a reference attachment to the OPNP1 and the OPNP2. I'll do it at the same time. And I'm going to go ahead and do live nesting depth of 1 and say OK. Then when I zoom in, it looks to me like I see some existing terrain data, but I don't see geometry, and I don't see a lot of stuff. That's because my nesting depth is 1, and I'm making a reference to an OPNP file that's got references to container files. So if you expand the hierarchy, what you'll see is that we end at the container file level, and we don't see any of the published work. The reason I'm seeing these features is because I have a reference attachment to the feature file. That's that file right there. That reference attachment to the feature file is redundant. If I look at the OPNP2, you'll see all those tick marks. All of those nested references inside the OPNP2, which is just a copy of the OPNP1, they were determined to be redundant. They're just redundant. So they're being controlled by everything in OPNP1. I don't like this situation. I could, well, let me turn that feature file back on. The first point I wanted to make was about depth of nesting. I'm not seeing all my information. All I'm seeing is my container files. So here's where I can select my files, can use a selection set in my reference dialog, and I can adjust the nesting depth. Should I set it to 20? No. Increase this incrementally, 1 unit at a time, until you see the data that you want to see. It's not necessary to go beyond that. If you go beyond the nesting depth where we start to see the published files, you might start to see working files. Some designers will make reference attachments to their published file that are working files. They're never intended to be seen when you're working with a CAD base. So you're limiting yourself to just the published information with that nesting depth. Don't go deeper. I still have redundant references. If I look at the OPNP 1, I can see all of the container files attached, but if I look at the OPNP 2, those are all determined to be redundant. Now, what if I wanted to remove the redundancy? Maybe I wanted to create a clipping boundary where in the north area, I wanted to display certain levels, and in the south area, I wanted to display other levels. That's a great way to use a clipping boundary to both remove the nested reference or remove the redundancy of those nested referencing, but it will also allow you to control the levels differently in the different areas. So back up with CAD base 2 on the left, we select the OPNP 1 on the right. I'm going to place a fence around the north area, and I'm going to apply a clipping boundary and accept that fence. I can go ahead and apply a fence at the bottom. We select that, place a new fence. I'm going to place it at the bottom. I can have overlap. It doesn't matter. The fence just needs to be different. I'm going to try to not have too much overlap. There's my clipping boundary for the bottom. Now they still look like they're redundant because I'm not seeing the bottom half. And they still appear redundant, even though I placed the fence. I need to take that next step of typing NE and reopening the file. And then I can see that I have my area at the top. I just changed my highlight mode so I can see, and I've got my area at the bottom. And I can adjust these for level display and also for reference display. I can adjust them differently because one thing about them is different, and that's the clipping boundary. I wanted to see if you folks have any questions about this redundancy and removing the redundancy.
Lenny, this is off topic with regards to references, but what are you using? What are you using the feature file for? What data is in there?
Excellent question. I'm going to take you to the East website. On the East website, just because I noticed this today, there's a what's new on the East website. And in the what's new, I've left this there. Last month, I added existing 3D features file for cross-section display or point control. That's what that features file is there for. So you could open this up and read how to create one, or you could watch the webinar. It was just, when was that webinar? Let's see, it was on the cross-section control. It must have been 7/12 or more recently. Why am I not doing a search? Lenny, do a search. FEAT. Existing 3D features file, feature. It was on the 26th. Create a 3D features file. I use it so that we can see in cross-section tiny little pluses, and they're also in the permanent section, but they are separated on different levels, and so I can turn them on and off